It's a bit of a rupture in the Republican Party. Donald Trump versus two of his own party's senators who are questioning his character and also his demeanor and his relationship with the truth, you might say. Check them out here. Arizona Senator Jeff Flake and Bob Corker of Tennessee. These two men are top Republicans in the Senate. Bob Corker at one point was a Trump supporter. Jeff Flake never was. Both of them will not be running for re-election next year, and it has given them, you might say, a greater opportunity to speak their own minds about Donald Trump. Jeff Flake, for example, giving a blistering speech on the Senate floor on Tuesday. Take a quick listen to this.
I will not be complicit or silent. I've decided that I would be better able to represent the people of Arizona and to better serve my country and my conscience by freeing myself of the political consideration that consume far too much bandwidth and would cause me to compromise far too many principles.
That's just a small snippet of what Jeff Flake went on to say time and again, basically going after President Trump. Meantime, Bob Corker saying that Trump debases the United States with both untruths and name-calling.
You think he's a role model to children in the United States?
No. The constant non-truth telling, the name calling, the things like, I think the debasement of our nation will be what he'll be remembered most for.
All right, let's bring in our guests into the conversation here. We've got Corey Crowley, Republican strategist, Steve Farnsworth, political analyst as well. So, Steve, let me start with you on this one. I mean, both of these men are not running for re-election, and they seem to be saying to their fellow Republican senators, listen, we are a co-equal branch of this government. We are supposed to have every much power as Donald Trump does. People need to start speaking out and standing up to this president.
Well, no doubt about it. This is terrible news for the Donald Trump presidency. Donald Trump has gone out of his way to fight with Republican members of the Senate since the day that he became president and started arguing about national security concerns. These Republicans in the Senate, although they tend to support most of them as legislation, they're really starting to fray at the edges. Whether you think about McCain, now Flake and Corker, you've got the people who disagreed with the president on health care, including Collins and Murkowski. You have a narrow Republican Senate majority, and when Trump and the Senate Republicans disagree, that's very, very bad news for the Republican agenda.
And we want to be clear, Corey, that both of these men, Corker and Flake, are Republicans, and they do support the vast majority of the Republican Party's agenda. What they're going after, really, is Donald Trump's character and his behavior and his fitness to be president, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's what most people's beef with Donald Trump has been since the very beginning of his candidacy, is that he just doesn't embody the characteristics or the persona and the values that Americans have come to expect in their president. And as Stephen pointed out, this makes passing his legislative agenda much more difficult. The other thing this makes difficult is Republican prospects of holding on to the Senate in the midterm elections next year. Incumbents have a vast amount of advantage when it comes to running for re-election. He's now removing that advantage in two key states. This may not be the end of the retirements. We've seen a lot more of them in the House of Representatives. And it needs to be noted, if Trump loses majorities in both of these chambers, he opens himself up to the next 2 years being all about impeachment and not even being able to pursue a legislative or policy agenda. So it's not very wise to ostracize your own party, especially when the margins are so close.
We want to show a tweet as well, because as usual, Donald Trump did not take any of this sitting down. Here's one. Jeff Flake, with an 18% approval rating in Arizona, said, a lot of my colleagues have spoken out. Really? They just gave me a standing O, exclamation point. So Donald Trump is basically saying, listen, you know, you guys were both on the path toward being defeated, because Bob Corker in Tennessee also would have had a tough road ahead. And here we go, another one. The reason Flake and Corker dropped out of the Senate race, very simple. They had zero chance of being elected, now act so hurt and wounded. So Donald Trump is not even taking this sort of quietly. He intends to push back very hard, as he often does, Steve.
Well, that's the Donald Trump strategy. Never admit any sort of defeat, never admit that there's any sort of problem. But certainly any observer of what's going on in Washington can clearly see that the Donald Trump presidency not only has gotten off to a bad start, but legislatively it hasn't even gotten out of the starting blocks. you're looking at a presidency that did not develop enough rapport with Republican senators. And one of the key things to remember here is that Corker and Flake are both relatively popular within the Republican caucus. These were not people who were seen as closet liberals or even moderates within the Republican caucus. These are serious, effective legislators who had a great deal of respect among their other Republican peers. And they've known each other a lot longer than Donald Trump has known the Republicans in the Senate. And so when you're looking at the effort by Donald Trump to make it sound like the Republicans can live without these two, Donald Trump is very wrong about that.
Corey, as you know, both of these men are still going to be senators for another 14 months, give or take, until January of 2019, if my math is correct. And so whether or not they will try to thwart the Trump agenda, vote against him, is an open question. Perhaps not, because, again, they do support a lot of Republican policy points. But I'm curious whether you think this, the two of them, maybe John McCain, a couple of others, is it going to trigger other Republicans who are still in the Senate, plan to run again? Will they start speaking out against Trump? I guess that's the question here, right?
Well, I would hope that this creates a bit of a snowball effect, and particularly with senators who aren't up for re-election in the next couple of years. McCain is a prime example. He was just re-elected. So for somebody like him to speak out, and some others like him, it would help a lot, because these aren't people who are under threat of having to face the same type of angry electorate that helped elect Trump. And so with a little time passing, and with the events that could change that nobody can predict, it could be a very different electorate 4 years from now than it will be in these midterms. So these members may not at all be threatened in their futures if they want to run for re-election by the Trump supporters. But for the moment, anybody up for re-election next year has to deal with the same kind of struggles that both Corker and Flake did, which is that there is a large part of the Republican base that is extremely loyal to Trump, that are very bought into the fake news rhetoric, that are bought into the fact that only he can tell the truth, and they will turn on any other Republican, even senators who've served them well, in order to defend this president.
How much damage, Steve, do you think this does to the Republican Party, bigger picture?
Well, it's important to remember that there are no permanent majorities or permanent minorities in American politics. Our system is incredibly close to 50-50 in election cycle after election cycle. And so anything that undermines the fortunes of one party can have pretty significant effects in terms of changing who's in the majority or the minority in Congress. It's also the case, I think, that you have that great unknown variable of what might be happening today or tomorrow or the next day that changes the calculation. But for the moment, you've really seen a very, very powerful run of bad luck for Donald Trump, or poor performance, if you will. You get into fights with widows and people who've lost children in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You get into fights with other Republicans. You promise things that you cannot deliver, whether it's health care or perhaps next in line, I don't know that the prospects for any kind of tax agreement is going to go very far either. So when you look at all the problems here, you're looking at a very tough environment for people to look at the Republican Party, who are not simply totally bought into what Donald Trump has to say, and say that this is a party that's working right now.
Corey, it would seem to me as well, and we want to be clear that, you were no fan of Donald Trump and didn't think he would become the nominee, let alone the president, yet here we are. Seems like Corker and Flake are basically saying, Trump has taken over our party, he's hijacked it, but let's look longer term. We need to be careful about what he is going to do to the Republican Party. We want this to be a one-off. We need to kind of right the ship. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I think that is how it will play out. Look, people are going to end up frustrated with Donald Trump the same way Democrats had to go through a realignment after Obama got elected. They had a couple of good years. They passed the health care bill. Then he quickly lost his majorities and, was never able to translate his own popularity down ballot to other races to help win majorities for his own party. And I think the same is going to be true of Donald Trump. He himself is very popular. I don't think that popularity is going to rub off on other people. And I think that the party will survive, although it's going to take some great effort by people who are much more pragmatic in the party to drive us back towards the things that we all believe in. Because Donald Trump, while he has done things like appoint a conservative to the Supreme Court, he's also moved our party far away on trade from our traditional platforms, on foreign affairs from our traditional platforms. And so those are places we're going to have to go back to our base eventually and philosophically make that argument again and strengthen our base to support us in those types of things.
Great to have you on, gentlemen. Thanks for this today.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.
Corey Crowley, Steve Farnsworth.